Hello biggies, now excitingly today we're going to be scraping the bottom of the barrel as we look for the ultimate, the definitive history of the IPA.
Nice, but what's this all Val doing here, Johnny?
So I promise I will address the Orval in the room at some point, but we're not going to start quite there. Actually, we're going to be talking to a beer historian, a real historian, like somebody who reads books rather than Wikipedia, to really get the truth behind IPA, because there's so many myths and legends attached to it, so many things that are just fundamentally wrong. Something I've learned through doing the research and through chatting to the man we're about to speak to is that even the history books got it wrong. So there's lots of references from like the late 1800s that have it wrong about the early 1800s. So we need to get our sourcing impeccable as we look for the true history of these beers that were going over to India during colonial times and have come to define pretty much the craft beer era.
Right, so who's the man to do this for us, Johnny?
The man we're going to be talking to is Martyn Cornell.
Love Martyn.
Famous beer historian, yes. Famous pedant on Twitter. And we spoke to him in the course of making our documentary, The Time Is Now, all about the history and indeed the future of English IPA. But we couldn't fit all of that stuff into our documentary. We had well over an hour of content with him. We're not going to give you all of that either, but we are going to be speaking to Martyn, who's going to give us the absolute, as far as we can do so far, definitive story of IPA, and we are going to be tasting through the IPAs as we go. Does that sound like good YouTube content that the algorithm's going to love?
Beautiful.
So yeah, what you'll next see is Brad and I on the way up to Cromer on the beautiful Norfolk coast to chat to Martyn Cornell at Poppyland Brewing about the history of IPA, starting in London.
Let's start at the very beginning. IPA was the name eventually given to the beers that were being exported from Britain to India. They were specially prepared to last the journey, which meant that they were more heavily hopped than beers that remained at home. They were not necessarily that much stronger. Maybe a little bit stronger, but they were. If a beer sold at home was about 6.5–7%, then a beer of the same type sold to go out to India would be 7.5. Not much more than 7.5 probably. So, but it was the hopping that was the secret of the success of these beers, because the hops kept spoilage organisms at bay. But what they didn't do was affect the most important yeast in these beers, which was Brettanomyces. And it was the Brettanomyces yeast that brought these beers into condition on the 4-month journey from Britain to India. Brewers didn't know what was going on, but they just knew that something happened on that voyage, and they ended up with a lovely drinkable beer, lots of beautiful esters and so on.
Where were these beers typically being brewed? Where did this sort of pale ale as prepared for India or IPA really originate, or do we not know?
Well, yeah, they started off, there was a guy called Hodgson, and he was the major supplier to the captains of what were called the East India Men, which were the ships that were operated by the East India Company, which had become, certainly by the beginning of the 19th century, a major political player, not just a trading company, which is what it started off as, but it became a major political player in India, and it had its own army, or armies. It had a huge setup of civil servants. The expression civil servant actually comes from the East India Company. They had their civil servants and their military servants. They had conquered large parts of India. They were raking in huge sums of money in tax and so on and so forth. And they had a large setup of people helping them to run this empire. And they were all homesick. So the East India Company ship's captains used to take out on their own, because the ships were largely going out empty and coming back with all the goods from India. They used to carry out trading on their own and take out all sorts of stuff to sell to the expats in India who were running the East India Company. And this included furniture, clothes, guns, food, cheese, wine, and beer. So they were doing this, they were buying this beer on their own account and then selling it to traders in India, and then it was being sold to the people that were there working for the East India Company. mostly, as I said, the middle classes, the ordinary working soldiers, they drank porter, and huge amounts of porter were exported to India right through until the 1850s at least, and some time after that, for the ordinary soldiers to drink. But the officers and the senior civil servants, they were the guys drinking the pale ale. So this chap Hodgson, he had a brewery on the River Lee, just up from Blackwall in London on the Thames, which is where the East India ships docked. And they didn't care where they got their beer from, particularly. He happened to be the closest guy. He gave them long credit, which was very important, so they didn't have to pay him then and there. He let them go out to India, sell the beer. They would then pick their money up probably on their second journey and then come back and pay him finally. So he was giving them, up to a year's credit, and that was great. So he almost by default became the major supplier of pale ale for India, and this started. You start seeing his name mentioned in newspapers in India in the 1780s, and this carried on until the 1820s. So it was a long time when this guy was pretty much the sole supplier of pale ale to India. And then he got greedy, or his son got greedy, and they decided that rather than sell to the ship's captains, they would ship it out directly on their own bat and get all the money and get all the profits. Well, the East India Company obviously got very grumpy at this because it was taking away the money that their ship's captains were earning.
Yeah, they've got an army.
Yeah, yeah, but not in this country they don't. So, but anyway, so they then went famously to Samuel Alsop, who was a big brewer in Burton on Trent. So the East India Company suggested to Mr. Alsop that he might like to brew beer for India. So he said, well, I could probably do that and knock some up. And the thing that nobody knew at that time was that Burton brewed pale ales are going to be much better than London brewed pale ales because of the brewing water that they're using. Chalky water in London, great for dark beers, not really that great for very hoppy pale beers. Gypsum, calcium sulfate water in Burton on Trent, Wells, terrific for pale beers and for beers that you want that lovely sparkly look through as you stare at the glass, and really hoppy beers. So Alsop and his big rival Mr. Bass rapidly drove Hodgson out of the market and started to, through the 1820s and into the 1830s, they're the guys that are now dominating this trade.
Can we circle back to the special preparation? What was that process?
They were just adding more hops. That was about it, and also probably almost certainly dry hopping. We have evidence that they were dry hopping the beer as well from a shipwreck, when there's a report that they survived by, first of all, they drank all the beer, and then they were sucking on the hops left in the casks. So obviously, we know therefore that they must have been dry hopping. Yeah. These beers. You wanted some hop character, but not a lot. You were mostly interested in a fair amount of bitterness, and that bitterness was there to reflect the large amount of hops which went in to preserve the beer. And a 19th century IPA was a beer that was meant to last for a year or more, at least, and to get all those mature flavours that Brett will give it. So probably the closest you'll get to a 19th century IPA today is something like Orville. It's very Bretty pale ale.
Yeah.
So,
and has late hop additions, I believe, as well.
And has late hop additions. So that was the original IPAs.
So thank you, Martyn. We can now address the reason why I had Orval in there. So there's a couple of interesting things to talk about while I open this beer. The first thing is that Brettanomyces, now we see it as a Belgian yeast, right? Yeah. But from what Martyn's saying is, not only did it start in the UK, this yeast, it's actually Brettanomyces. British yeast.
Come on.
So these yeasts were made famous by the brewing done in Britain. So yeah, this is as close as we can get to the original IPAs. Those have all but disappeared. So Orval is a Trappist beer. It's a lively Trappist beer. Blimey, I poured that carefully. You're welcome.
Thank you for the several inches of head you from beer.
I'm going to nail mine now as well.
Look at this.
Yeah, I learned
What a
my
stitch
lesson.
up.
Learned my lesson. So yeah, what we're expecting. I mean, this is a pale ale. That's even how the monks describe it. So we're going to hopefully have some of the characters we might expect from a more modern IPA that we'll get into. But most importantly, we're going to have late hopping because this beer is hopped pretty late in the process during fermentation. But also loads of Brettanomyces, this British funky yeast.
It's very punchy, isn't it? It's got that little farmyardy thing going on. A lot of people say horse blanket.
Yeah, but nobody knows what that actually means.
I find it like acidic on my nose. It's like it's got like a real sort of sharp kind of thing.
I think it's a Foxwell apple. You know,
It's
a
an
sharp
appley. It's
appley.
an appley sharpness, almost like you'd expect from like a cider.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
It's orchardy or scrumpy cidery. You definitely get that kind of character. You also, I think, like get a real fruitiness from it as well. Like
It's a fresh funk.
almost pineapple or something. Yeah, exactly. It's
not like
a little bit farmyardy, but
Yeah.
it's not. It's more like kind of sweet-smelling rotting apple, not the really funky stuff.
Yeah, it's like it's not a dank funk. It's a freshy funk.
And I think that comes also from the fact that it's combined with a fruitiness from the hops, a spiciness from the hops, and indeed like a caramel kind of malt character, which for me creates kind of orange sherbet vibes as well. Cheers.
Cheers.
And then the other thing that these IPAs would have been, which Orval is, again, is incredibly dry.
Yeah.
So Brett eats all the sugars that the normal yeast, the Saccharomyces couldn't consume. So you end up with no sugar left, which means that although it smells sweet, fresh, acidic, it's bone dry. It's Jacob's cracker, brown burnt toast. Well, not burnt toast, sorry, brown toast.
Yes.
It's crumbly almost. The other thing to talk about is the colour as well, because often people think about IPAs as being very, very pale. But I think back then maybe this would be close. I mean, Martyn said it could range from anything just lighter than porter all the way to, you know, probably not quite Pilsner levels of brightness, but very bright. So I think this is probably about right as well. So now we know what the original 1800s IPA would have tasted like. And now we're going to learn from Martyn how we got to where we are today with the modern English IPA.
So that was the original IPA. It took off in Britain in the 1840s and became a popular drink, but nothing like as popular still as originally porter, and then porter was replaced by mild, and it was always very much the middle class drink. After the First World War, like all beers in the First World War, it suffered severely from lowered gravities simply to try to keep it more affordable, because stronger beers attracted heavier tax. So to keep the beer affordable, strengths plunged, and so the average strength of IPA in Britain dropped probably down to about 4%, 4.5% alcohol, and it became really just a synonym for best bitter. So there was for probably 60 or 70 years after the First World War, there was no real difference between...
Even the hopping rates were pretty similar.
Even the hopping rates was very similar. So there was no real difference between an IPA as sold in Britain and a best bitter or something like that.
So it seems that IPA went through a pretty radical change very quickly at the start of the 20th century. We could have picked one of those beers like Green King IPA that never really recovered essentially from that, so it's still down there like 3.5%, and people say, oh, that's not really like IPA, and you're like, well, actually it is a lot like IPA for the last 100 years, but it's not what it should be.
Yeah.
So we picked a beer which hopefully tastes like it should be in a modern style. So essentially the Brett's been removed, but I think generally otherwise we should be expecting the same kind of malt character, the same level of bitterness, the same spicy floral Goldings kind of character, and I believe this is Goldings, English malt and Goldings hops. So this is pretty close to what it would have been. Obviously, this is brewed modern, it's probably Maris Otter or something like that, rather than Chevalier malt. It's a lively one. There we go. So it is re-fermented in the bottle. Hence why that just happened. It must have got a little bit excitable.
Caramelly, toffee, appley.
It's definitely spicy as well, though. Like almost cinnamon.
So that's coming from the hops, the British hops, right?
I think probably from the Goldings, yeah. Like Goldings for me, although it presents very earthy and has quite a sort of prickly bitterness to it, it also smells I always get kind of spicy honey from Goldings hops, and that's definitely They're Here For Me. They're Here For Me. There you go. There you go. I mean, it smells delicious. I think the cliche is that these beers are often quite twiggy, So they're saying you get a lot of the brown, earthy flavours and not a lot of the more vibrant stuff. But this couldn't be further from Twiggy. It's spicy, caramelly, honeyed. It's a really lovely, sweet, complex aroma.
Yeah, big time.
And this is 5.7, so it is a pretty big beer. Probably still a little bit lower than it would have been way back then. But still, you know, decent, robust.
It's a big session.
500 ml of that, yeah. Yeah, you'll be well on your way. To modern English IPAs.
Cheers.
So yeah, plenty bitter. Probably could be more bitter. But incredibly dry again.
Dry. It's got that, the caramel thing really carries through.
A little bit toasty as well. More toasty than the Orval certainly was. So yeah, caramel, brown toast. And yes, spicy and hedgerowy.
It's warming.
Warming, yeah, exactly. Yeah, you want to sit down by the fire,
Yeah.
you know, in a tavern. I'd want to go to a tavern, not a pub. Unless it's called Ye Olde something, you know?
Ye Olde Tavern.
Ye Olde Tavern, yeah, that's where I want to go. That's the dream. So yeah, it's just a really nice, robust, malty beer that's backed up by lots of dryness that makes it very drinkable.
Yeah.
Which isn't always true of other Fuller's beers. So they've definitely brewed it to be more bitter and to be drier than their other beers. So interestingly, IPA never really had its day in the sun in the UK as sort of a mass market beer. So it was kind of destroyed by the First World War. All the ABVs dropped right down to be, you know, similar to mild and then to bitter. And bitter was the style that sort of took off the back of that. Maybe people preferred a little bit of sweetness to the beer, a little bit more, you know, residual malt sweetness, whereas IPA was incredibly dry, incredibly bitter. And Martyn alluded to the fact that people found the bitterness a little bit tricky, except for those sailors that were eating the hops that he talked about. So yeah, never quite had its day in the sun, and then something else came along and consigned it to history almost. So it didn't have to be a historical style. It was still being brewed, and then a new style came along and went,
See you later.
back you go, back to the 18th century. And that was the American IPA. So now we're going to hear about the genesis of that from Martyn as well.
Now we come to a guy called Bert Grant, who was born in Scotland, brought up in Canada, and in the 1980s he started the very first home brew pub in the United States, in Yakima. And he produced a number of beers, one of which was a very hoppy beer, and he called it IPA because he knew, he was well versed in the history of British brewing, and he knew that well hot beers were called IPA, so that's what he called it. He used a lot of American hops, Cascades and things like that. Those styles of beers were copied and also influenced by the Sierra Nevada brewery, which had brought out Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, which is a very hoppy beer. Sierra Nevada Pale Ale was probably the first American IPA, but they never called it IPA. So it's never been recognised, or never been actually given the name IPA, but I think most people would recognise it as that what it was. So IPA now in the States became the name given to these very hoppy, very floral, very resiny beers using masses of American hops, which was about as far from the 19th century IPA probably as it's possible to get.
So now we're, if not in the modern day, we're pretty close. We're about 1978, 1980.
It's pretty much modern day.
Yeah, I mean, neither of us were born, but it's modern. And we're here with one of our favourite beers on Earth, and one of the most important beers to have been brewed in the last 50 years. So this isn't the original American IPA. There's arguments, Liberty Ale by Anchor, the beers that Martyn was talking about, and probably some other ones that, you know, never really got the recognition they deserve, and we just don't know their names anymore. But in terms of cultural impact, this is the original IPA. This is the one that was copied across the US as a result of how good it was.
What was the magic behind it? They took this. It's kind of the same sort of recipe and approach to beer, right? But they kind of turbocharged it with the hops they had locally.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you'll see again, it's pretty much the same colour.
Very similar colour.
Exactly, yeah. So the inspiration for this beer came directly from these kinds of beers, which were being drunk by the beer lovers over on the West Coast. The big change was the use of American hops, so in this case, Cascade. So these hops, actually, I mean, Steve Grossman, who founded Sierra Nevada, he had a homebrew store, And he was selling Cascade hops to other people and going, these are amazing. And then I guess eventually went, they're so amazing, I could probably do something with this. And then he cobbled together his milk vats and made the first Sierra Nevada brewery. But yeah, it was the Cascade that was giving these beers a different character. So although Martyn says, they couldn't be further removed from what English IPA originally was, and he's right, the difference between that and that is huge. The difference between that and this
Is the hops?
is literally an ingredient variant.
Yeah.
But it does, as we're about to find out, completely change the character of the beer. So it's citrus, grapefruit, pine. There's still that caramel note that's run through all three of them.
Yes.
But it's been pushed to be aroma forward now. Hop forward, aroma forward, heady, incredibly fruity.
Hello, old friend.
I mean, yeah, I know this aroma so well, and I love it so much, and it never gets old. And you can see why people who are drinking this for the first time, some of them would have been put off by the bitterness, but as we know, that's been the case for centuries. But some of them would have just had their minds blown, like we did when we had our first American IPAs. We're like, what the hell is this? And yeah, all of that just comes from one decision to use a different hop. So it's very bitter. There's lots of caramel. There's all of that, unique aroma that we've already talked about. It's a little bit less dry.
It is less dry. But that, I think, with everything else going on, that doesn't make it less drinkable, right?
No, I think it as the bitterness has gone up even further,
Yeah.
it needed a little bit of sweetness to balance that. And to play right with the very sweet hop aromas that we're getting. Because if you've got very sweet hop aroma, but it's very dry, it can feel like they're clashing.
Confusing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But actually it works really well by just having a little bit more malt sweetness to it. Yeah, I mean, you can almost sort of see trace the history of our flavours and preferences in humanity wide through all of these, and definitely in beer drinkers. In that back then they'd have been delighted to have some Brett character. That's what they kind of wanted in an aged beer, and now we want none of that. We want less of the dryness. We want more of the hop character. So we have made a documentary basically about the history from this point onwards, telling the story of modern IPA as it progressed, and telling that through the medium of the hops that were being used and the hop growers who were making them. And we made that with Siren Craft Brew, and you can watch that at the end of this. It's a fascinating documentary, well, I think, about how much our palates have changed very, very quickly, because this took, here to here is 150 years. Here to here is 50, 30,
If
30,
that,
yeah.
If that, right? I mean, it was. I think this is the thing with America, land of the free and the brave and all that, land of opportunity. They've got these new flavours from the new world, and as you say, your man was just selling home brewing equipment, saw the opportunity to make something totally different, world-changing, and seized that opportunity, and they've never looked back.
So I hope you've enjoyed that, well, I was going to say little, probably quite long history of IPA. I think everything in there is verifiable, but if you have any questions, any comments, do hit us up in the comment section below. Obviously, history, despite it already happening, changes quite a bit.
Yeah.
As we discover new evidence and stuff like that. So this is not probably the definitive, but it's about as definitive as it gets. And I think we are definitively drinking one of the most important beers ever brewed.
Come on.
To IPA.
To IPA.